JonBenét Ramsey mystery case solved, the disturbing truth no one expected. We've been circling this case for decades now, haven't we? The death of JonBenét Ramsey has become something of a cultural fixture, a name that carries weight, a story that refuses to settle into comfortable resolution. And perhaps that's precisely because the documented facts of the case seem to actively resist the narratives we've been offered. From the moment that 3-page ransom note materialized on the staircase, something fundamental fractured in the investigation. What followed wasn't just a search for truth, but a collision between what the evidence whispered and what the investigators needed to believe. We approach this reflection not with judgment, but with a kind of philosophical curiosity. The same curiosity that drives us to understand why certain narratives take hold, while others, supported by forensic reality, fade into the background. There are critical gaps in the story that framed Patsy Ramsey as the orchestrator of an elaborate deception. Gaps that deserve our attention not because they exonerate or condemn, but because they reveal something profound about how we construct truth from fragments, how we fill silence with assumption, and how easily institutional certainty can override scientific fact. 1. The riddle of the ransom note, intent versus inconsistency. The foundational pillar supporting the theory of an internal crime, a staged kidnapping orchestrated from within the house, rests almost entirely on the ransom note itself. In the affidavit for the search warrant, we learn that Patsy Ramsey discovered this note at approximately 5:45 a.m. on December 26th, positioned deliberately on the spiral staircase where it couldn't be missed. The note demanded a specific sum, $118,000, not a round number, not a dramatic $1,000,000 ransom, but $118,000, a figure that, according to John Ramsey's 1998 interview with Detective Smith, corresponded almost exactly to his net bonus for that year. Think about that for a moment. The specificity of that number immediately suggests intimate financial knowledge, the kind of detail only someone with access to private information would possess. It's the sort of clue that turns the spotlight inward, toward the household itself. And yet this very specificity introduces our first philosophical contradiction. If the purpose of staging was to deflect suspicion outward, why embed a detail that so obviously points back to the family's private finances? Why not choose a random, untraceable figure? This question has troubled us for years because it suggests either profound carelessness in the staging or something more complex, a psychological need that transcends simple logic. The composition of the note itself presents another layer of anomaly, one that resists the theory of panic-driven improvisation. According to the search warrant affidavit, the note was written on lined paper taken from a pad found inside the Ramsey home, utilizing a pen that was also located near the telephone. In the deposition of Detective Bob Whitson, we learn that several pages were missing from that pad, and crucially, the page preceding those missing sheets contained the partial writing, Mr. and Mrs. R, widely interpreted as an abandoned first attempt. This detail is extraordinary when we pause to consider its implications. Someone stood in that house, began writing a ransom note, discarded it, started again, and produced a final version spanning 2.5 pages. This suggests deliberation, time, a kind of careful construction utterly at odds with the frantic emotional state one would expect immediately following a violent loss. Yet the content of that final document introduces a stunning inconsistency. The note explicitly warns against involving law enforcement, threatening immediate and horrific consequences. The word used was decapitation, if this instruction is ignored. In her 1998 interview, Patsy Ramsey confirms that despite reading this chilling warning, she and John immediately proceeded to call 911. Why? If we accept the theory that Patsy herself authored this elaborate script, Why would she include a core instruction that she knew or planned to defy within minutes? The standard explanation is that the note was meant to buy time, to establish a false narrative. But if that's true, why not simply omit the warning? Why create a document that makes your subsequent actions appear suspicious and contradictory? The forensic realities of authorship deepen this puzzle considerably. According to experts cited in the Death of Innocence book, the note's exceptional length, 2.5 pages of careful, consistent handwriting, suggested something that troubled even hardened investigators. Writing such an extensive document immediately following a violent loss would have been beyond the emotional and psychological capacity of almost anyone, even someone with criminal experience. The implication was clear. If the note was written by someone in the house, it must have been written beforehand, suggesting premeditation rather than panic-driven staging after an accident. But here's where the scientific evidence fractures the prevailing theory entirely. Documents reviewed in the Wolf vs. Ramsey civil case confirmed that all 6 handwriting experts consulted, 4 hired by the police and 2 by the Ramseys, conclusively eliminated John and Burke as authors of the ransom note. As for Patsy, none of the experts identified her as the author. Her probability of authorship was rated at very low, specifically 4.0 to 4.5 on a 5-point elimination scale, where 5.0 represents complete elimination. We've sat with this fact for a long time, turning it over, examining it from different angles. If the materials came from inside the home, if the script was meticulously crafted with intimate family knowledge, yet scientific analysis exonerates the known occupants, what are we left with? The logical conclusion seems almost impossible to accept. Someone had access to that house, to those materials, to that private financial information, yet managed to mask their handwriting so effectively that forensic experts couldn't link them to any known family member. This speaks to a profound level of control, a calculated effort at deception that goes beyond simple staging. It suggests planning, patience, a willingness to spend time in that house constructing a narrative. And it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what we think we know about criminal behavior, about panic, about the psychology of someone who could write such a document in such circumstances. From a psychological perspective, the note itself reveals something deeply unsettling about the mindset of whoever composed it. The language alternates between formal and colloquial, between threatening and almost conversational. There are phrases borrowed from movies, attaché, Southern common sense, references that suggest someone steeped in popular culture. There's a strange intimacy to it, particularly in how it addresses John Ramsey directly, almost as if the author is establishing a relationship, a dialogue. This isn't the language of a desperate parent trying to deflect blame. It's the language of someone enjoying the construction itself, someone taking pleasure or finding psychological release in the act of creation. The physiological realities of stress and trauma also deserve our attention here. When the human body experiences severe psychological shock, certain cognitive functions become compromised. Memory formation can be disrupted. Decision-making capacity narrows, focusing on immediate survival or emotional needs. Fine motor control, the kind required for consistent, careful handwriting across 2.5 pages, often deteriorates under extreme stress. The body floods with adrenaline, hands shake, focus fractures. Yet this note shows none of those markers. The handwriting, while perhaps slightly irregular in places, maintains consistency throughout. There are no dramatic deteriorations, no signs of the physical toll that genuine panic would exact. This forensic detail whispers something important. Whoever wrote this note did so in a state of relative calm, or at least with enough self-control to mask the physiological effects of distress. Anthropologically, we might consider what the note reveals about the author's cultural context and social awareness. The references, the tone, the specific threats chosen. All of these reflect someone embedded in American middle-class culture, someone familiar with crime narratives from film and literature. The mention of foreign faction and group of individuals suggests an awareness of how kidnapping narratives typically unfold, how they're expected to sound. This isn't someone operating outside societal norms. This is someone who understands those norms intimately enough to mimic them, to construct a convincing facade. What does it mean when the person responsible demonstrates such sophisticated cultural literacy while simultaneously carrying out such a destructive act? From the perspective of criminal mindset analysis, the note becomes even more revealing. The length itself serves multiple psychological functions. It provides the author with a sense of control over the narrative, an opportunity to direct the investigation down specific paths. It establishes complexity where simplicity might have sufficed, suggesting someone who needs intellectual engagement even in crisis. The inclusion of specific instructions, when to expect the call, how to prepare the money, creates the illusion of an ongoing scenario, buying time not just in practical terms but in psychological ones. It forces the family and investigators to enter into the author's constructed reality, to play roles in a script they didn't write. And yet, despite all this careful construction, the note contains that fatal instruction that was immediately violated. We keep returning to this point because it refuses to resolve itself. If the goal was staging, why create an obstacle to your own plan? Unless, and this possibility deserves consideration, the violation of the instruction was itself part of the design. Perhaps the person who wrote this note understood human psychology well enough to know that any parent finding such a document would immediately call for help, regardless of what the note commanded. Perhaps the contradiction was intentional, meant to create confusion, to muddy the investigative waters from the very beginning. The philosophical question that emerges from all of this is profound. What kind of mind operates with such dualism? Careful planning coupled with deliberate contradiction, intimate knowledge paired with effective disguise, cultural sophistication alongside devastating violence. We're not dealing with simple criminal logic here. We're confronting something more layered, more psychologically complex. The note becomes not just evidence of a crime, but a window into a mindset that defies our comfortable categories of perpetrator behavior. If the evidence pointed away from the family, why did the police cling so tenaciously to their theory? This script demands we understand the motives not only of the presumed perpetrator, but of the investigators themselves, who seem to need a conclusion that the forensic facts fought so fiercely against. There's a human dimension to confirmation bias that deserves our compassion even as we critique its consequences. When investigators arrive at a scene suggesting internal involvement, the note, the body found in the basement, the seemingly inconsistent statements, a narrative begins to form. And once formed, that narrative becomes remarkably resistant to contradictory evidence. It's not malice, it's the way human cognition protects itself from uncertainty, creates coherence from chaos. But in this case, that very human tendency may have directed the entire investigation down a path that led away from truth, rather than toward it. Theme 1. The psychology of constructed narrative and its resistance to scientific fact. We've examined countless cases over the years, and what strikes us most powerfully about this ransom note isn't what it says, but what its very existence reveals about how narratives take hold and refuse to release their grip on our understanding. When we approach this document logically, we're immediately confronted with a series of deductive impossibilities that should have fractured the family staging theory from the beginning. The note was written on materials from the house, this we know. Multiple handwriting experts eliminated John and Burke entirely and rated Patsy's probability of authorship as very low. Yet the investigation proceeded as if these scientific conclusions were somehow negotiable. as if expert analysis could be overridden by intuition or circumstantial suspicion. Let's trace this logical chain carefully because it reveals something troubling about how certainty displaces evidence. If Patsy wrote the note, she must have disguised her handwriting so effectively that 6 separate experts, using different methodologies and approaching the evidence from different institutional positions, all failed to identify her as the author. This would require not just casual effort but sophisticated knowledge of forensic analysis techniques, understanding which characteristics experts examine and how to manipulate those characteristics consistently across 2.5 pages. Is such deception possible? Technically, perhaps. But we must then ask, where did this expertise come from? Patsy Ramsey, by all accounts, had no background in forensic science, no training in handwriting analysis, no documented interest in these specialized fields. The likelihood that she could spontaneously produce such effective disguise while simultaneously managing the emotional and logistical chaos of staging an entire crime scene strains credibility to its breaking point. We're being asked to believe in an extraordinary convergence of capabilities manifesting precisely when needed, without prior practice or preparation, while under the most severe psychological duress imaginable. Philosophically, this confronts us with questions about truth and how we determine it in the face of competing epistemologies. We live in a world where scientific methodology exists precisely to counter the limitations of human perception and bias. Handwriting analysis, when conducted by multiple independent experts using established protocols, provides us with conclusions based on measurable, reproducible criteria. These aren't guesses or hunches. They're systematic evaluations of stroke patterns, pressure variations, letter formations, spatial relationships, quantifiable characteristics that reveal authorship with reasonable reliability. Yet in this case, those conclusions were essentially dismissed because they didn't align with the investigative narrative that had already taken root. Watch what happens when we do this. Science becomes just another opinion, no more authoritative than gut feeling or circumstantial interpretation. The foundation of evidentiary reasoning begins to erode. We're left asking what evidence even means if scientific analysis can be set aside whenever it contradicts what we've decided must be true. This isn't a small methodological problem. It's a philosophical crisis in how we adjudicate between competing truth claims. When does expert consensus matter? When can it be ignored? Who decides? The psychological dimension here reveals something even more troubling about how we construct guilt and innocence in the public imagination. There's a phenomenon in criminal psychology called narrative primacy, the tendency for the first comprehensive story to establish itself as the default truth, requiring far more cognitive effort to dislodge than to maintain. Once the story became mother-staged, elaborate cover-up, every piece of evidence had to be filtered through that lens. The handwriting analysis didn't eliminate her, it just meant she was clever enough to fool the experts. The length of the note didn't suggest someone with time and calm. It suggested someone with unusual psychological capacity to dissociate during crisis. The specific financial knowledge didn't require access from outside. It just confirmed family involvement. Watch how each scientific fact becomes bent, reinterpreted, forced to fit the established narrative rather than being allowed to challenge it. This cognitive process isn't unique to this case. It's a fundamental feature of how human minds manage complexity. We construct explanatory frameworks and then defend them against contradiction because changing frameworks requires dismantling everything we've built on top of them. The cost of being wrong increases with every investment we make in being right. For the investigators, admitting the family might not be responsible would have meant acknowledging months or years of misdirection, resources misallocated, public statements that would need retracting. That's an enormous psychological burden, and it's far easier, far more human to find ways to make the evidence conform than to admit the framework itself might be flawed. From a physiological standpoint, we need to sit with what the body experiences during extreme psychological trauma and why this matters for evaluating the staging theory. When someone loses a child, particularly in violent, unexpected circumstances, the autonomic nervous system undergoes profound disruption. Cortisol floods the bloodstream, triggering a cascade of stress responses. Heart rate elevates dramatically, often sustaining at 120 to 140 beats per minute or higher. Blood pressure spikes. Breathing becomes shallow and rapid. Cognitive function narrows to immediate survival processing. What psychologists call perceptual narrowing or tunnel vision. Executive functions like planning, sequencing, and abstract reasoning deteriorate significantly. Fine motor control, the kind required for writing, deteriorates even more dramatically. Studies of individuals in acute trauma states show marked decrease in handwriting consistency, increase in pen pressure variability, deterioration of letter formation, shakiness in line quality. These are involuntary physiological responses. They can't be willed away or suppressed through determination alone. Yet the ransom note shows none of these markers. The handwriting remains relatively consistent throughout, suggesting the author was in a state of relative physiological calm, or had sufficient time and emotional distance to produce careful work despite distress. Now, could a parent in shock somehow override these physiological responses? Could adrenaline, determination, or dissociation create a window of unusual capability? The human body is capable of extraordinary things under stress. We know this from documented cases of hysterical strength and crisis performance. But we're not talking about a burst of strength lasting seconds or a moment of hyper-focus lasting minutes. We're talking about sustained, detailed work requiring planning, revision, and careful execution over what would have to be at least 30 to 45 minutes, more likely an hour or longer. The physiological implausibility doesn't make family involvement impossible, but it does require us to imagine a stress response so unusual, so outside normal trauma patterns, that its very rarity should have prompted investigators to consider alternative explanations more seriously. Forensic criminology offers us additional perspective that deserves careful consideration. When examining staged crimes, investigators look for specific behavioral markers, evidence of hesitation, overcorrection, or performative elements that reveal the gap between authentic and constructed behavior. Ransom notes in staged kidnappings typically show certain recognizable patterns that distinguish them from genuine criminal communication. They're usually shorter because length creates opportunities for inconsistency and contradiction. They're more formulaic, often mimicking television or movie versions of what such a note should say, without the sophistication of actual criminal thought processes. They tend to avoid excessive detail because detail creates exposure, increases the risk of saying something that doesn't align with physical evidence or timeline. They show evidence of the writer's limited experience with this type of communication. Awkward phrasing, uncertain tone, references that don't quite land right. Yet this note violates those patterns entirely. It's exceptionally long, almost luxuriantly so. It's specific in some areas, the exact ransom amount, the timing of the call, the consequences of disobedience, and deliberately vague in others, creating a kind of controlled ambiguity that suggests sophistication rather than inexperience. It contains cultural references that land perfectly, suggesting genuine engagement with crime narratives rather than superficial mimicry. From a forensic behavioral standpoint, it reads more like the product of someone who had time to think, to craft, to enjoy the process of creation, not someone frantically covering up a devastating accident in the dark hours of early morning. The anthropological lens reveals something equally important about how cultural context shapes both criminal behavior and investigative response, creating blind spots that can persist for decades. In Boulder, Colorado in 1996, the prevailing cultural narrative around crime in affluent communities carried very specific assumptions rooted in class, education, and social position. Violence was supposed to come from outside, from intruders, from strangers, from those who didn't belong to the educated middle class that defined Boulder's self-image. The city prided itself on being safe, cultured, progressive. Serious crime, particularly violence against children, was supposed to be an urban problem, a lower-class problem, someone else's problem. When violence erupted within that protected space, within a family that embodied everything Boulder valued, education, success, beauty, cultural engagement, the cultural shock demanded explanation. And the most psychologically satisfying explanation, the one that allowed the community to maintain its self-image while making sense of the disorder, was that the family must have been hiding darkness beneath their prosperity. This wasn't just an investigative conclusion. It was a cultural need to make sense of disorder by locating it within a framework that preserved existing beliefs about who commits violence and why. If the perfect family could contain such darkness, then the violence came from within, from concealed pathology, from the gap between appearance and reality. This narrative allowed investigators and community members to maintain their assumptions about external threats while explaining the internal catastrophe. But what if that cultural narrative, precisely because it was so psychologically satisfying and culturally coherent, prevented everyone from seeing what the evidence actually suggested? From the perspective of criminal mindset analysis, the ransom note reveals something we should have paid closer attention to from the very beginning. Whoever wrote this document had a profound need for control over the narrative itself, over how the events would be understood and interpreted. This isn't just about creating an alibi or deflecting suspicion in some crude, practical sense. The note is too elaborate for simple deflection. Too carefully constructed, too psychologically complex. It's creating an entire alternative reality. Foreign factions, groups of individuals, complex instructions, specific threats, even philosophical musings about Southern common sense and being rested. This level of narrative construction suggests someone for whom the story itself provides psychological satisfaction. Someone who needs to author not just the crime, but the interpretation of the crime. That's not typical staging behavior, not the mark of a panicked parent trying to buy time. That's something else entirely, a kind of performative control that extends beyond the immediate practical needs of avoiding detection into something more psychologically layered. The person responsible needed to construct meaning, to impose order on chaos through language, to create a script that others would follow. Why? What psychological need does this serve? Perhaps writing the note provided distance from what had happened, allowed the author to reframe events through the lens of this fictional scenario. Perhaps the act of composition itself, the deliberate, controlled intellectual work of crafting sentences and constructing plot, served as a psychological counterweight to the chaos of violence. Or perhaps the person responsible simply took pleasure in the intellectual exercise, in demonstrating control and capability even in the aftermath of destruction. And here's where the philosophical and psychological dimensions converge into something deeply unsettling that we need to sit with. If we accept that the note was written by someone with access to the house, access to private financial information, time to compose and revise, sufficient calm to produce consistent handwriting, and a sophisticated understanding of how to disguise authorship from forensic analysis. If we accept all of that, then we're describing someone far more complex and calculating than the panic-driven parent theory ever allowed for. We're describing someone with capability, patience, and a deeply layered psychological relationship to control and narrative. Someone who could operate in that house, in those circumstances, with enough composure to execute a plan requiring multiple steps, careful attention to detail, and sustained focus. Someone who understood forensic investigation well enough to create a document that would resist definitive attribution. someone who possessed or had access to knowledge about that family's finances, movements, relationships. Someone who could move through that space with enough familiarity to locate materials, know where to place the note, understand the family's routines well enough to time everything precisely. This isn't the profile of a stranger intruder acting on impulse, but neither is it the profile of a grief-stricken mother acting in panic. It's something else, something that doesn't fit comfortably into either category the investigation allowed itself to consider. The question becomes, why did the investigation resist this complexity? Why did it need the simpler story even when the evidence pointed towards something more disturbing and multifaceted? Perhaps because accepting the alternative, that someone with this level of sophistication and access could operate within and around that household without being immediately identified, opened up investigative possibilities that were simply too vast, too difficult to contain. A family member, despite the tragedy, provides closure, however painful. It offers a bounded set of suspects, a limited range of motives, a narrative that can be resolved within the existing framework of domestic violence or accident gone wrong. An unknown person with intimate access creates endless uncomfortable questions about vulnerability, about how well we actually know the spaces we inhabit and the people who move through them. It suggests possibilities that are harder to investigate, harder to prove, harder to contain psychologically. It means someone could have been watching, learning, planning, moving through that house in ways the family never detected or understood. It means the violation went deeper than a single terrible night. It extended backward in time, into periods when the family believed they were safe, private, protected. That's a different kind of horror, one that doesn't offer the same psychological resolution as the family theory, despite how much more closely it aligns with the actual forensic evidence. Theme 2, the temporal paradox and the question of capability under duress. Let's turn our attention now to something that troubles us deeply about the timeline itself, not just what happened when, but what would have been physically and psychologically possible in the hours we're examining. If we accept the theory that someone in the house discovered JonBenét in crisis, panicked, and then staged an elaborate scene to conceal what happened, we need to map out what that staging would have required step by careful step. And when we do that carefully, methodically, accounting for each element that would have needed to occur, the timeline begins to fracture under the weight of its own implausibility. According to the affidavit, the ransom note was discovered around 5:45 a.m. The note itself took time to compose. We're talking about 2.5 pages of careful writing, including at least one false start evidenced by the Mr. and Mrs. R fragment on the preceding page. Working backward from that discovery time, we need to account for multiple sequential tasks. The time required to recognize the crisis, the emotional processing of that recognition, the decision to stage rather than call for help immediately, the retrieval of materials from elsewhere in the house, the notepad from one location, the pen from near the telephone, the assessment of what materials would be needed for binding and other staging elements. Then the actual composition of a first draft, whatever length it reached before being abandoned. The abandonment itself, the emotional and practical decision to start over. The composition of a second draft spanning multiple pages requiring sustained focus and physical control. And finally, the placement of that note where it would be discovered at the right moment. How long would all of that require, even under ideal conditions? Even assuming calm, focused attention, uninterrupted time, emotional stability sufficient to think clearly and execute precisely. We're looking at 30 to 45 minutes minimum for just the note composition and placement. More realistically, considering the need to move through the house gathering materials, dealing with the physical evidence, thinking through each step, we're probably looking at an hour or longer just for this one element of the supposed staging. But these weren't ideal conditions, were they? If we're imagining someone who just lost a child, We're imagining someone in profound shock, experiencing acute psychological trauma of a magnitude that most people will never encounter in their entire lives. The body floods with stress hormones that compromise cognitive function in measurable, predictable ways. Heart rate spikes and remains elevated. Blood pressure surges. Breathing becomes erratic. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and rational decision-making, effectively goes offline, shunting resources to the limbic system focused on immediate survival responses. Under those conditions, the ability to think clearly, plan sequentially, and execute complex multi-step tasks deteriorates significantly, often dramatically. Psychologists studying decision-making during crisis have documented how stress narrows cognitive focus, creating tunnel vision that makes elaborate planning extraordinarily difficult. Time perception distorts. Memory encoding becomes fragmentary. The capacity to think about how actions will appear to others, the kind of metacognitive awareness required for effective staging, largely evaporates. Yet we're being asked to believe that someone in this state not only conceived of a sophisticated staging plan, but executed it with enough control to produce consistent handwriting, include specific details that would later seem significant, avoid leaving obvious evidence of the panic we'd expect to see in the construction itself. The logical problem deepens considerably when we consider what else would have needed to happen during those same hours, creating a timeline that becomes increasingly difficult to reconcile with human capability under stress. According to the crime scene evidence, JonBenét was found in the basement wine cellar, wrapped carefully in a white blanket that John later described as positioned as if somebody was tucking her in. Her wrists were bound with white cord in what were later described as relatively loose bindings, not tight enough to leave deep marks. There was a garrote fashioned from cord, and a broken piece of one of Patsy's paintbrush handles, representing a relatively sophisticated toggle-type device requiring specific knowledge of how such implements function mechanically. If this was staging, then someone had to. First, locate the child after the crisis occurred, wherever that initial location might have been. Move her to the basement, navigating stairs while carrying a 6-year-old. Locate the white cord. Where was it stored? How long to find it? Locate the paintbrush, break it in a way that would serve the purpose. Fashion the device with enough mechanical understanding to make it functional. Apply the bindings in a way that would appear authentic to investigators. Locate the white blanket, again from where? How long to retrieve it? Wrap her carefully with attention to creating that appearance of being tucked in. Position her in that specific room, not just dropped or hidden, but deliberately placed. Close the door, then return upstairs, transitioning back into the role of discovering parent, preparing to call 911 to respond to arriving officers, to perform grief in a way that would appear authentic under immediate scrutiny. All of this while maintaining enough psychological composure to avoid making errors that would immediately reveal staging, and while managing the physical toll of stress and grief. From a physiological perspective, what we're describing here approaches the limits of human capability under duress. The body simply doesn't function normally under this kind of stress. Motor control degrades. Decision-making becomes impulsive rather than strategic. The ability to sequence complex tasks, to remember multiple steps and execute them in order, deteriorates significantly. There's a phenomenon in trauma psychology called functional dissociation. The ability to compartmentalize emotional response and operate with unusual clarity during crisis, almost as if separating oneself from the experience while it's happening. It does occur, particularly in individuals who've experienced prior significant trauma and developed coping mechanisms for psychological survival. Interestingly, Patsy Ramsey had survived stage 4 ovarian cancer, an experience that John Ramsey later described as formative in her determination to be with the children. Could that prior trauma have created the psychological architecture for unusual composure during subsequent crisis? Could someone who'd faced their own mortality and fought through it with determination have developed dissociative capacity that would allow them to function with unusual clarity even in devastating circumstances? Theoretically, perhaps. But we'd be describing a level of dissociative capability that's extraordinarily rare even among trauma survivors. The ability not just to maintain basic function, but to execute complex multi-step planning requiring strategic thinking and sustained focus. And such capacity, if it existed at that level, would almost certainly have manifested in other areas of life in ways that would have been noticed, documented, raised concerns among family members, friends, medical professionals who knew her well. We have no evidence of such patterns in Patsy's documented history. The forensic criminology perspective asks us to examine what the physical evidence reveals about sequence, state of mind, and the coherence of the staging theory. The binding found on JonBenét showed specific characteristics that sit in tension with each other, whispering contradictions that deserve our attention. The wrists were loosely bound, as we mentioned, not tight enough to restrict movement significantly. Not tight enough to leave the deep marks we'd expect from functional restraint. This suggests either performative binding done for appearance rather than function, or binding done by someone who couldn't bring themselves to apply genuine force, who retained enough emotional connection to the victim to be gentle even while constructing the appearance of violence. Either interpretation points towards someone with complex emotional relationship to what they're doing, not simple rage. Not pure utility, but something psychologically layered. The garrote, by contrast, was far more elaborate, a sophisticated toggle-type device requiring knowledge of mechanical principles, understanding of how pressure and leverage function. Capability to fashion something functional from household materials. These two elements sit uncomfortably together. The loose wrist bindings suggest hesitation, perhaps guilt or lingering affection, an inability to fully commit to the brutal logic of the staging. The sophisticated garrote suggests capability, planning, a kind of mechanical detachment that allows for precise construction without emotional interference. How do we reconcile these? What mindset produces both gentle ineffectiveness and brutal efficiency in the same scenario? One possibility is that different elements were created at different times, perhaps even by different individuals, which would fracture the single perpetrator staging theory entirely. Another is that we're witnessing psychological oscillation, moments of emotional connection alternating with moments of dissociative focus. But that oscillation itself would be remarkable, suggesting psychological complexity far beyond what the simple staging in panic theory allows for. Anthropologically, we might consider what these binding devices represent in the cultural imagination of crime, and what their presence reveals about the person responsible's cultural literacy and psychological framework. The garrote in particular carries specific associations in American crime narratives. It's not a common method in domestic violence, not something most people would think of spontaneously. But it appears frequently in film and literature as a signature of professional operatives, serial predators, organized crime, foreign agents, exactly the kind of perpetrators suggested by the ransom note's foreign faction language. Someone staging a crime scene to suggest outside involvement would logically include such a device because it codes culturally as stranger danger rather than family violence. It speaks the visual language of sophisticated criminal intent rather than domestic accident or rage. But here's what troubles us and won't let us rest. Creating a functional garrote from household materials requires either prior knowledge, having seen or made such a device before, or trial and error, experimentation, learning through attempt. There's a learning curve to fashioning something like this. It's not intuitive. Did the person responsible know how to do this already, suggesting prior experience or study of such methods? Or did they experiment in those crucial hours, making and remaking until it worked, trying different configurations until one proved functional? And if the latter, doesn't that suggest even more time, more focus, more psychological removal from immediate grief than seems humanly possible under the circumstances we're imagining? How long would it take to fashion such a device without prior knowledge? 10 minutes? 20? Longer? Each minute we add compounds the timeline problem, extending the window of composed, focused activity during what should have been the most psychologically catastrophic period imaginable. The criminal mindset analysis here reveals something we cannot ignore, something that whispers through every element of this supposed staging. Staging a crime scene requires theatrical thinking, the ability to imagine how evidence will be interpreted by others and to construct that evidence accordingly. This is sophisticated metacognitive work, thinking about thinking, anticipating interpretation, understanding the semiotics of evidence and how investigators will read the signs you're creating. It requires stepping outside your immediate emotional state and considering how your actions will appear to external observers who will arrive with their own frameworks and assumptions. Under normal circumstances, this kind of strategic reasoning requires calm, psychological distance, the ability to adopt an external perspective on your own situation. It's the kind of thinking that typically occurs in planning stages before action, not during acute crisis. But we're being asked to believe this happened in the midst of the most devastating emotional crisis a parent can experience, in the dark hours of early morning when cognitive function is already compromised by circadian rhythm, under time pressure created by the knowledge that other family members might wake, or that the planned early departure would make discovery inevitable. Could it happen? Could someone under that specific combination of circumstances somehow access this level of strategic theatrical thinking? The human mind is capable of extraordinary adaptations, this we know from documented cases. But what we're describing here isn't an ordinary stress response or even an extraordinary one. It's a response so unusual, so outside the documented range of trauma behavior, that it would represent a significant outlier in trauma psychology literature. And when an explanation requires us to imagine an extreme outlier occurring spontaneously, while simultaneously discounting more straightforward possibilities that align better with documented stress responses, we have to ask ourselves whether we're following the evidence or forcing it to match our preferred conclusion. Philosophically, there's something important happening in how we assign probability to different scenarios, and why some explanations feel more satisfying than others regardless of evidentiary support. The human mind tends to find complex conspiracies more narratively satisfying than random violence or undetected predation. There's a psychological completeness to family member staging that unknown person with access simply doesn't provide. The former offers closure, explanation, a kind of psychological resolution. We can understand the motive, panic, protection, fear of consequences. We can trace the sequence, accident, cover-up, performance. It forms a complete story with beginning, middle, end. The latter leaves us with uncomfortable openness, with the recognition that terrible things can happen without clear motive that makes sense to us, without satisfying narrative arc, without the kind of psychological coherence we need to feel we understand what happened. But truth doesn't care about our narrative preferences. Truth doesn't organize itself according to our psychological needs for closure and meaning. Truth simply is. And if the timeline doesn't actually accommodate the staging theory without requiring extraordinary psychological and physiological assumptions, each individually unlikely, collectively approaching impossibility, then perhaps our preference for that narrative has been preventing us from seeing what the evidence actually suggests when we strip away our need for a certain kind of story. Theme 3. The collapse of certainty and the weight of what cannot be unseen. We need to spend more time with the investigators' response to this timeline, to these contradictions, because something broke in the investigation early. something that prevented course correction even when evidence mounted that should have prompted serious reconsideration. The Boulder Police Department committed to the family staging theory with remarkable speed, within hours of the initial response, and that commitment hardened into certainty despite accumulating contradictions. We've tried to understand this not with judgment but with curiosity about how institutional thinking can become trapped by its own assumptions, creating a kind of investigative tunnel vision that makes course correction psychologically impossible even when the evidence demands it. According to Mark Beckner, who later became police chief, the department focused on the family because the scene appeared inconsistent with forced entry. The basement window area, despite John's account of having broken it months earlier, was found undisturbed with no fresh footprints in the dust. This observation became foundational to the investigative theory. If there was no point of entry, then the perpetrator must have been already inside. Logic seems clear, reasonable. Except this reasoning depends entirely on the assumption that the lack of disturbance proves lack of entry, rather than considering alternative explanations. That entry had occurred through different means, that disturbance had been carefully avoided, that someone with familiarity with the house knew how to move through it without leaving obvious traces. The dismissal of possible entry points directly clashes with multiple investigative reports confirming the presence of evidence pointing definitively towards someone from outside the family circle. In the 2008 exoneration documents, we learn that unidentified male DNA not matching any Ramsey was found in 3 locations on 2 separate articles of JonBenét's clothing. In her undergarment, likely from saliva, and on the waistband of her clothing beneath representing touch DNA from skin cells. This wasn't trace contamination from manufacturing or casual contact. The quantity, location, and profile of this DNA pointed toward direct intimate contact between JonBenét and an unknown male. Additionally, the legal review in Wolf v. Ramsey summarized undisputed facts, including the discovery of unidentified HITEC shoe prints in the basement, impressions left in dust or residue near the wine cellar area. Neither Parent nor Burke owned this brand of footwear. This was confirmed through exhaustive inventory of family possessions. An unidentified palm print was found on the wine cellar door, again not matching any known family member or authorized individual who had reason to be in that space. Why did the local police discount this overwhelming evidence? John Ramsey, in his interview, suspected the police were blowing off the other inputs because they were so firmly fixed on the family, so invested in their theory, that contradictory evidence couldn't be integrated without dismantling everything they'd built. The true tragedy here lies in the psychological phenomenon of confirmation bias prevailing over objective science, a cognitive pattern that's remarkably resistant to correction once established. Confirmation bias operates at multiple levels: perceptual, memorial, interpretive. We tend to notice information that confirms our existing beliefs more readily than information that contradicts them. We remember confirming instances more vividly. We interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support rather than challenge our frameworks. None of this is malicious or even conscious. It's simply how human cognition manages the overwhelming complexity of reality by creating filters that make information processing more efficient. But those same filters in investigative contexts can create devastating blind spots. Each piece of evidence gets sorted into supports our theory, or doesn't matter, can be explained away. The DNA becomes contamination despite the profile and quantity suggesting otherwise. The palm print becomes could be from anyone, despite systematic elimination ruling out known individuals. The shoe prints become irrelevant despite their location and the absence of that brand from family possessions. Watch what's happening. Not one piece of exculpatory evidence is allowed to challenge the core theory. Each gets individually dismissed through ad hoc reasoning, preventing the accumulation of contradictions from reaching critical mass that would force reconsideration. This is confirmation bias in action. Not a single catastrophic error, but 1,000 small interpretive choices, each individually defensible, collectively pointing the investigation away from truth. Psychologically, we need to understand what was at stake for investigators in maintaining their theory despite mounting contradictions. The police's adherence to the domestic accident leading to staging theory as the sole viable explanation required them to discount not just physical evidence, but also the documented personal history and character of the primary suspect. John Ramsey emphasized in his interview that Patsy had fought and survived stage 4 ovarian cancer precisely so she could be with the children. This was her stated motivation during treatment, her reason for enduring aggressive chemotherapy and surgery, her purpose in surviving what doctors had warned was likely unsurvivable. She had faced her own mortality and chosen to fight explicitly for the chance to be present in her children's lives. The idea that this determined survival instinct, this fierce maternal drive that had sustained her through years of medical crisis, would be instantaneously derailed by a minor domestic issue, the bedwetting rage theory police favored, and replaced by behavior that would separate her from her surviving child, that would destroy everything she'd fought to preserve, simply does not pass the sanity test, as John Ramsey claimed. It requires us to believe in psychological discontinuity so extreme that it erases everything we know about this person's documented priorities, values, and character. Could people act out of character under extreme stress? Of course. But we're not talking about a momentary lapse or impulsive reaction. We're talking about sustained, calculated behavior over hours that contradicts every documented pattern of this person's life and stated values. The investigation immediately became adversarial in ways that compounded the family's trauma and created a self-fulfilling cycle of non-cooperation and suspicion. According to John Ramsey's account, the police refused to release JonBenét's body for burial until you came in for an interrogation, using the most fundamental human need to properly lay their child to rest as leverage to force cooperation. This decision transformed what might have been cooperative investigation into antagonistic confrontation. When you tell grieving parents that they cannot bury their child unless they submit to interrogation while under immediate suspicion, you're not creating conditions for truth-seeking. You're creating conditions for protective lawyering, for adversarial positioning, for the very non-cooperation that investigators would later cite as evidence of guilt. The family, advised by attorneys after realizing the depths of police suspicion, became guarded in ways that were interpreted as consciousness of guilt, rather than rational response to being treated as suspects. Rather than grieving parents deserving support, watch the cycle. Police suspicion creates family defensiveness, which confirms police suspicion, which intensifies family defensiveness, spiraling into complete investigative deadlock where neither side can see the other clearly anymore. In the interview with Detective Haney, Patsy Ramsey was shocked to learn that medical records suggested signs of prior intrusion, a fact she stated she was entirely unaware of and which clearly distressed her deeply. This moment deserves our attention because it reveals how little the police theory aligned with the family's actual lived reality and internal knowledge. If Patsy was responsible, if she was covering up domestic patterns that had led to this crisis, wouldn't she have known about prior medical findings? Wouldn't that knowledge have shaped her response, her statements, her entire approach to the situation? Instead, we see genuine surprise, confusion, distress at information she clearly didn't possess. The police interpreted this as performance, as calculated ignorance meant to deflect suspicion. But there's another interpretation that fits the evidence more naturally. She didn't know because there was nothing to know within the family's awareness, because whatever had happened, Whatever the medical evidence suggested had occurred outside the family's knowledge and observation. The question becomes, did the police interpret the parents' raw, overwhelmed grief, Patsy's reported emotional volatility, John's composure and need to regain control over some aspect of the terrible situation, as confirmation of guilt rather than simply diverse coping mechanisms for unimaginable trauma? Did they mistake shock, grief, protective instinct, and fear of being wrongly accused for the signs of culpability they expected to see? The eventual scientific exoneration confirmed what the forensic evidence had been whispering all along. But the damage inflicted by the prolonged focus on the family remains a profound element of this story that we cannot separate from the investigative failure itself. Boulder County District Attorney Mary Lacey's 2008 public letter, based on advanced DNA analysis techniques that hadn't been available in 1996, declared that the unidentified male DNA found in 3 separate locations on 2 different articles of JonBenét's clothing was definitively foreign to the family, and in her assessment, belonged to the person responsible. The letter explicitly cleared John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey of any suspicion in the commission of this crime. This vindication, arrived at through scientific method and technological advancement, came nearly 2 years after Patsy Ramsey had passed away from her cancer, which had returned and taken her before she could see her name publicly cleared. According to John Ramsey's statements, the initial suspicion and subsequent media frenzy, which authorities had intentionally fueled by leaking information to create public pressure, hoping to force a confession through social isolation and shame, had taken a crushing toll on the family's ability to grieve, to heal, to move forward. Every moment of their private loss had been conducted under public scrutiny and assumption of guilt. Every attempt to honor their daughter's memory was shadowed by suspicion. Every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone with their surviving son occurred under the weight of unresolved accusation. The investigation, constrained by the belief of the officers that they could get them off the streets via psychological pressure and tactical maneuvering rather than following forensic evidence, failed to adapt when the facts contradicted the narrative. This represents not just investigative error, but a kind of institutional hubris that mistook certainty for truth, that confused the coherence of their theory with its accuracy. Resources that should have been dedicated to following the DNA, tracking down the source of the unknown palm print, identifying who owned HI Tech shoes and had access to that house, investigating individuals in the family's wider circle who might have had the access and knowledge the evidence suggested. All of those investigative avenues remained under-resourced, underexplored, essentially abandoned, because they didn't fit the established narrative. We've tried to understand this with compassion for the enormous pressure investigators face, the trauma of working child cases, the institutional demands for resolution. But compassion for their situation doesn't excuse the outcome. A misdirection that has left the person truly responsible unidentified and unapprehended for decades, free to move through the world while a family suffered under wrongful suspicion. Philosophically, we're confronted with questions about justice, truth, and the systems we've created to pursue both. What does it mean when institutional certainty overrides scientific evidence? When the need for resolution creates premature closure that forecloses actual investigation? When investigators become so invested in a theory that they cannot see the contradictions accumulating around them? We're not talking about a single catastrophic failure, but a systemic one. A pattern of interpretive choices, resource allocation, investigative priorities, all flowing from an initial narrative that felt true, felt complete, felt psychologically satisfying in ways that made contradictory evidence seem like obstacles to overcome rather than signals to reconsider direction. This case becomes a lesson in epistemological humility, in the necessity of holding theories lightly enough that they can be modified or abandoned when evidence demands it. But that humility requires acknowledging uncertainty, sitting with ambiguity, accepting that we might not know, and in high-profile cases with intense public pressure and institutional expectations, that acknowledgement becomes psychologically almost impossible to sustain. The legacy of this case extends beyond the individual tragedy, becoming a kind of cautionary tale about how investigations can fail not through lack of effort or dedication, but through the very human tendency to construct narratives and then defend them against reality. Every investigator who worked this case undoubtedly cared about finding truth, about achieving justice for a child who'd been taken. Their commitment was real. Their intentions were honorable. But commitment and good intentions don't automatically produce truth. Sometimes they produce the opposite, a kind of determined certainty that prevents us from seeing what's actually there. The forensic evidence was always present. The DNA that didn't match, the palm print no one could identify, the shoe impressions from a brand the family didn't own. These facts never changed. What changed was the technology that allowed more sophisticated DNA analysis, finally making the evidence too definitive to ignore or explain away. But that evidence, in less sophisticated form, was there from the beginning, whispering the same message. Someone outside this family was intimately involved. The investigation chose not to hear that whisper because it contradicted the narrative that felt true, that fit their understanding of how these crimes occur, that promised the kind of resolution that would bring order back to the chaos. The tragedy isn't just a child lost, though that remains the irreducible heart of this story, the loss that can never be reconciled or repaired. The tragedy is also how the investigation of that loss became an additional trauma, how the pursuit of justice became misdirection, how scientific evidence was subordinated to psychological need for narrative closure, and perhaps most troubling, how easily this happened, how understandable each small choice was in isolation, how the path from initial response to complete investigative deadlock was paved with reasonable-seeming decisions that, accumulated over time, led somewhere nobody intended to go. This case asks us to sit with that discomfort, to recognize how fragile truth-seeking is when confronted with the human need for certainty. How easily investigations can drift away from evidence when narrative feels more compelling than science. 2. The staging of tragedy, pineapple, panic, and protection. The reconstruction of the critical hours after the family returned home on Christmas night reveals chronological and behavioral gaps that challenge every comfortable assumption about this case. We've circled this timeline for months, actually years if we're honest, and certain details keep surfacing not because they're dramatic but because they quietly dismantle the narratives we've been offered. The pineapple is one of those details. It seems almost absurdly small in the context of everything else domestic and ordinary, but its presence reshapes our understanding of those final hours in ways that demand our attention. In his 1998 interview with Detective Smith, John Ramsey was unequivocal, definitive in a way that brooks no uncertainty. He was positive neither he nor Patsy fed JonBenét after they returned home from the Whites' Christmas gathering. The child was sound asleep, he insisted, carried from the car to her bed without waking, still wearing the clothes she'd had on at the party. Patsy Ramsey corroborated this account in her 1997 interview, describing JonBenét as really zonked from the long, exciting day of Christmas celebration. Both parents painted a picture of a sleeping child, unresponsive, exhausted, transferred directly to bed without the usual bedtime routine. No snack, no conversation. Just the quiet transfer from car to bedroom that parents of young children know well. The careful navigation of stairs, the gentle placement into bed, the whispered hope that the movement won't cause waking. Yet the autopsy confirmed the presence of pineapple in JonBenét's digestive tract, partially digested, suggesting consumption within a few hours of her passing. This isn't speculation or ambiguous finding. This is biological fact, matter identified and verified. The pineapple existed. Someone fed it to her, or she fed it to herself. Somehow, between returning home and the crisis that occurred later, pineapple entered her system. Both parents explicitly denied providing this food, so we're left with a gap, a space in the timeline that doesn't resolve itself no matter how we approach it. In his later interview with Detective Smith, John Ramsey offered reasoning that reveals the psychological stakes of this seemingly minor detail. If an intruder had forced the sleeping child to eat, he argued, wouldn't she have screamed bloody murder? The logic seems sound. A child awakened by a stranger, frightened, would cry out, would alert parents sleeping elsewhere in the house. Therefore, John reasoned, admitting they fed her would have simply ended the discussion with police, would have been easier than maintaining denial in the face of physical evidence. But if it would have been easier to admit feeding her, why maintain the denial? What makes the denial necessary despite its complications? There are several possibilities here, each pointing in different directions. Perhaps the denial is rooted in genuine amnesia or confusion, the kind of memory disruption that severe psychological shock can create. Under extreme stress, memory encoding becomes fragmentary, unreliable. Details that seem important later simply don't register or consolidate during crisis. It's possible the parents truly don't remember a midnight snack, a brief waking, a moment of care they provided without noting its significance. But there's another possibility that deserves consideration. Perhaps the denial is strategic, calculated. Perhaps admitting she was awake and eating after returning home would unravel a larger framework about what happened in those hours. Not because the parents were responsible, but because acknowledging she was awake opens questions about who else might have had contact with her, who else might have known she was up, what other interactions might have occurred that the family preferred to keep private for reasons we can only guess at. Or, and this possibility troubles us most, perhaps the denial is genuine but the memory is false. Perhaps JonBenét did eat pineapple, but the parents didn't provide it, didn't witness it, were unaware it occurred. Which means someone else had access to that child in that house during hours when the family believed everyone was sleeping safely. The pineapple in this interpretation becomes evidence not of parental dishonesty but of intrusion the family never detected. Someone moving through that space with enough familiarity to locate food, to interact with the child, to operate unnoticed while the household slept. This forces a hard look at the psychological mechanics of memory, truth-telling, and the gap between what we know and what we think we know. The human mind constructs memory from fragments, filling gaps with assumptions and expectations. When parents say with certainty that something didn't happen, they're often reporting not comprehensive surveillance of every moment, but rather the absence of any memory of it happening. The distinction matters. I didn't feed her pineapple might mean I have no memory of feeding her pineapple, which creates space for the possibility that memory is incomplete rather than that the statement is deliberately false. Under the stress and chaos of the following hours, finding the note, calling police, the influx of people, the hours of waiting, the discovery of the body, earlier details could easily be lost, overwritten by more salient trauma. The compromised state of the crime scene further complicates our ability to understand what happened in those crucial hours, revealing how panic and perceived duty clashed in ways that obscured rather than illuminated truth. According to John Ramsey in his 1998 interview, upon finding the 3-page note, Patsy instantly called 911. This immediate call, defying the explicit chilling warning in the note against contacting authorities under threat of immediate harm, suggests a pure, instinctual panic reaction rather than calculated criminal obedience. If Patsy had written the note as staging, if she'd crafted those warnings knowing she'd ignore them, why include them at all? The performative theory requires us to believe she created obstacles to her own plan, manufactured contradictions that would later seem suspicious for no clear strategic benefit. But the immediate 911 call, while understandable as panic response, created investigative complications that would reverberate through the entire case. According to a supplemental police report, Patsy then called friends of the Ramsey family who arrived shortly after the first officer. The Whites, the Fernies, people who cared about the family, who wanted to provide support during what appeared to be a kidnapping crisis. According to retired Detective Bob Whitson, this practice immediately contaminated the scene in ways that would prove impossible to remediate, yet at the time, it looked like a legitimate kidnapping, so the immediate support system was allowed to remain. This wasn't malice or even negligence in the traditional sense. It was human response, the instinct to gather loved ones during crisis, to not face the unthinkable alone. But it was also a monumental investigative error, one that shifted the emotional context of the scene from crisis management to forensic chaos. Think about what this contamination accomplished, however unintentionally. Multiple people moving through the house, touching surfaces, potentially disturbing evidence, their presence erasing or obscuring traces that might have told us who else had been there. The DNA that would later prove so crucial, was it complicated by this early contamination? The palm print on the wine cellar door? Could investigators ever be certain it came from the critical moments rather than innocent contact during the morning chaos? The shoe prints in the basement, were there more initially, later obscured by the foot traffic of those early hours? We can't know, and that uncertainty is itself a kind of loss, a foreclosing of investigative possibilities that might have pointed toward truth. From a psychological standpoint, this chaos introduces another interpretation of the non-cooperation that investigators later cited as evidence of family guilt. The parents were advised by attorneys after realizing the depths of police suspicion, after understanding that they were being investigated not as grieving parents, but as potential perpetrators. That advice, to limit statements, to proceed carefully to protect themselves legally, was rational response to the adversarial position the investigation had taken. But it was interpreted as consciousness of guilt, as the behavior of people hiding something. Watch how this reasoning works. If you cooperate fully, immediately, without legal protection, you're behaving as innocent people should. If you seek legal counsel, exercise your rights, proceed with caution, you're behaving as guilty people would. The framework leaves no room for the possibility that innocent people might rationally protect themselves when they realize they're suspected of the unthinkable. The discovery of the body several hours after the initial 911 call presents another layer of psychological contradiction that the staging theory struggles to accommodate. According to the police affidavit, John Ramsey was prompted by Detective Linda Arndt to conduct a further search of the house. This was hours into the ordeal after the time frame mentioned in the ransom note for the supposed call from the kidnappers had passed without contact. John went to the basement with Fleet White, and in the wine cellar he found her. He vividly described the scene to investigators. JonBenét was wrapped in the white blanket, positioned carefully, bound with the white cord on her wrists and the garrote around her neck. The blanket placement struck him particularly. As if somebody was tucking her in, he said, a detail that speaks to care, to a kind of tenderness utterly at odds with the violence of what had occurred. This intimate staging, if that's what it was, creates profound psychological contradictions we need to sit with. The person responsible took time to wrap her, to position her as if sleeping, to create the visual impression of care and comfort. This suggests either a deep psychological need to deny what had happened, to reframe it as peaceful sleep rather than violent loss, or perhaps lingering affection that couldn't be entirely suppressed even after causing harm. The bindings tell a different story. The tight cord, the sophisticated garrote, the mechanical efficiency of their construction. How do we reconcile these competing elements? What mindset produces both the brutal efficiency of the binding devices and the gentle care of the blanket positioning? If this was staging meant to suggest kidnapping gone wrong, the care seems counterproductive. Kidnappers don't typically tuck their victims in tenderly. The detail humanizes the perpetrator, suggests emotional connection rather than cold criminal logic. Unless, and this interpretation troubles us, the person responsible needed to reconcile what they'd done with how they felt about this child, needed to impose some final gesture of care that would allow them to live with themselves afterward. This speaks to psychological complexity, to internal conflict, to someone struggling with the gap between their actions and their self-concept. It's not the behavior of a panicked parent trying to create a convincing false narrative. It's the behavior of someone whose relationship with the victim was layered enough that they couldn't entirely suppress tenderness even while engaged in terrible harm. From a forensic perspective, the positioning also raises questions about staging versus authentic crime scene behavior. Organized offenders, those who plan, who think through their actions, who maintain psychological control, often engage in behaviors that reflect their psychological needs beyond simple crime commission. They might position bodies in ways that reflect fantasy, that serve symbolic purposes, that allow them to impose meaning on violence. The tucking in gesture, the careful wrapping, these could be elements of someone fulfilling psychological needs related to control, to transformation, to reshaping the victim according to internal narrative. This isn't staging for investigators' benefit, it's staging for the perpetrator's psychological benefit, creating a scene that allows them to tell themselves a particular story about what they've done and why. The anthropological lens asks us to consider what these behaviors reveal about the person's cultural framework and emotional relationship to the victim. The blanket, the positioning, the care despite brutality. These reflect someone socialized within norms that value gentleness toward children, that associate blankets with comfort and safety, that understand tucking in as an act of parental love. Someone entirely outside those cultural norms wouldn't think to include these elements. They're performing, perhaps unconsciously, cultural scripts about how we care for children, even while having harmed her. This suggests someone embedded within similar cultural context as the family, someone who shares their value systems at least superficially, someone who would feel the weight of having violated those norms profoundly enough that they needed to impose some gesture of adherence even after the violation was complete. The tension in the chaotic events of December 26th forces us to ask questions that resist comfortable answers. Was the non-compliant behavior an expression of guilt and concealment, or simply raw human response to devastating trauma, tragically misinterpreted by investigators conditioned to see only what they expected? Was the scene contamination malicious or just the human need for support during crisis? Was the pineapple evidence of parental dishonesty or evidence of access the family never knew existed? These questions don't resolve themselves. They sit in the evidence, whispering contradictions that fracture every narrative we try to impose. Theme 1. The physiology of trauma and the problem of performed normalcy. We need to examine more carefully what the human body and mind can actually accomplish under severe psychological distress, because the staging theory requires capabilities that sit uncomfortably against what trauma psychology and physiology tell us about stress responses. When we imagine someone discovering their child in crisis, whether that discovery represents genuine shock or guilty knowledge, we're imagining a moment of such profound psychological impact that it fundamentally alters cognitive and physiological function. The body doesn't simply continue operating normally while emotional turmoil occurs in parallel. The entire system reorganizes around survival processing. The immediate physiological cascade is measurable, predictable, remarkably consistent across individuals. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activates within seconds, flooding the bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. Heart rate spikes dramatically, often to 140, 160, sometimes 180 beats per minute. Blood pressure surges. Large muscle groups receive priority blood flow while fine motor control deteriorates. The hands shake. Vision narrows, literally, as peripheral awareness contracts to focus on immediate threat. Hearing becomes selective, filtering out ambient sound while hyper-focusing on perceived danger signals. Time perception distorts. Moments stretch. Hours compress. The normal flow of temporal awareness fractures into something nonlinear and fragmented. Memory encoding shifts from detailed, contextual recording to fragmented sensory snapshots. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, reasoning, and complex decision-making, effectively goes offline as the limbic system assumes control, prioritizing survival over strategy. Now, within this physiological state, we're asked to imagine someone executing the following sequence: recognizing the crisis, processing what it means, making the decision not to call for help immediately, but instead to construct an elaborate alternative narrative, gathering materials from different locations in the house, composing a multi-page document requiring sustained focus and consistent handwriting, revising that document at least once, carefully placing it for discovery, then attending to the body itself, moving it, binding it, wrapping it, positioning it with care. Each of these steps requires not just gross motor function but fine control, not just immediate reaction but sequential planning, not just emotional management but sustained psychological composure across an extended time frame. The physiological reality whispers something important. What we're describing approaches the outer limits of human capability under acute stress, requiring either extraordinary dissociative capacity or simply more time and psychological distance than the timeline and emotional context allow. Psychologically, there's another dimension we've been circling that deserves direct examination. If we accept that someone in that house staged this scene, we need to account for the performance of normalcy that would have been required not just in the immediate hours, but in the days, weeks, months that followed. Patsy's behavior on December 26th was documented by multiple observers: friends who arrived to provide support, police officers who interacted with her, paramedics on scene. By all accounts, she was emotionally volatile, oscillating between hysteria and dissociation, unable to provide coherent timeline details, focused obsessively on the ransom note and its instructions. Is this what guilt looks like? Or is this what devastating shock looks like? The investigative theory requires us to believe she was performing grief while actually experiencing guilt and fear of discovery. But performance at that level, under that scrutiny sustained across hours of interaction with people who knew her well, we're describing acting capability so sophisticated it would be remarkable in trained performers working from script under controlled conditions, let alone someone improvising under unimaginable pressure. From a forensic criminology perspective, we look for behavioral tells, micro-expressions, verbal slips, physiological indicators that performance is occurring rather than authentic emotional response. Trained investigators watch for these markers, and the Boulder police certainly scrutinized Patsy's every word, gesture, expression. Yet what they documented doesn't read as performance failing under pressure. It reads as trauma manifesting in ways that looked suspicious to observers expecting certain patterns of grief. She was too emotional, then too composed, too focused on the note, then too scattered to provide useful information. Too concerned with appearance, then too disheveled to care. Each observation was interpreted through the lens of suspicion rather than recognized as the chaotic, contradictory nature of genuine trauma response, where emotions surge and recede unpredictably, where control and collapse alternate without pattern. where the mind grasps for anything stable, like focusing on the tangible note, while the unbearable reality remains too vast to fully process. The philosophical question emerges. What does authentic grief look like, and who gets to decide? We carry cultural scripts about how mourning should manifest. Certain expressions, certain timelines, certain patterns of emotional display. But grief is radically individual, shaped by personality, prior trauma, cultural background, physiological stress response patterns. Some people collapse immediately and remain collapsed. Others go into organizational mode, needing control over something, anything, in the face of utter loss of control. Some oscillate between extremes. None of these responses indicates guilt or innocence. They simply indicate the vast range of human reactions to unbearable pain. Yet the investigations seem to expect a specific performance of grief and interpret a deviation from that expectation as evidence of deception rather than evidence of individual variation in trauma response. Anthropologically, we need to consider how class, education, and cultural background shaped both the Ramsey's stress responses and investigators' interpretations of those responses. The Ramseys were educated, affluent, accustomed to managing their public presentation, trained through professional and social contexts to maintain composure under pressure. These skills, developed over decades of navigating business and social situations, didn't simply vanish during crisis. They became part of how they managed the unmanageable. Patsy's concern with appearance even during trauma wasn't evidence of misplaced priorities. It was the activation of deeply ingrained coping mechanisms, familiar patterns of behavior that provided some small measure of psychological stability when everything else had shattered. But to investigators from different class backgrounds, different cultural frameworks, this concern appeared suspicious, seemed to indicate someone more worried about image than authentic grief. The cultural gap in interpreting behavior became another barrier to accurate assessment. Another way the investigation saw guilt where evidence of innocence existed in equal measure. From the criminal mindset perspective, if we imagine for a moment that Patsy was responsible and staging occurred, we need to account for the psychological architecture that would make such behavior possible. People who successfully stage crime scenes and maintain deception under intensive interrogation typically show certain characteristics: prior experience with deception, sophisticated understanding of investigative process, capacity for compartmentalization and emotional detachment, absence of the attachment bonds that would create internal conflict between actions and self-concept. Does Patsy's documented history suggest these characteristics? By all accounts, she was deeply bonded to her children, emotionally expressive rather than detached, without background in criminal behavior or particular sophistication about forensic investigation. She had survived cancer through determination and connection to family purpose, not through psychological detachment. The profile doesn't fit, which doesn't make involvement impossible. People can act radically out of character under extreme circumstances. But it does mean we're asking for an extraordinary psychological transformation, a spontaneous development of capabilities typically built over time through experience and personality structure, manifesting perfectly in the single most stressful moment imaginable. The physiological evidence from the days following also deserves our attention. Patsy was hospitalized briefly for exhaustion and dehydration, her system essentially shutting down under the accumulated stress. This isn't the pattern we see in perpetrators successfully maintaining deception. It's the pattern we see in trauma victims whose bodies can no longer sustain the stress response. The system collapses when the immediate threat passes and delayed reaction sets in. Guilty knowledge typically produces a different physiological trajectory: ongoing hypervigilance, sustained elevated stress markers, the chronic activation associated with maintaining lies under scrutiny. The collapse pattern suggests someone whose system mobilized for crisis, finding the note, discovering her daughter was gone, and then crashed when the enormity of loss could no longer be held at bay through adrenaline and purpose-focused activity. Logically, if we trace the implications of the physiological evidence, we arrive at a troubling conclusion. Either the staging theory requires us to accept an extraordinary convergence of unlikely psychological and physiological capabilities manifesting spontaneously under maximal stress, or the staging theory itself needs fundamental reconsideration. The investigative narrative asks us to believe Patsy possessed dissociative capacity far beyond normal range, acting ability sophisticated enough to fool intimate observers, emotional control sufficient to execute complex plans while in shock, physiological capability to override automatic stress responses, and psychological architecture to separate action from emotion completely. Any one of these would be remarkable. All together, simultaneously, without prior evidence or subsequent demonstration, we're describing something so statistically improbable that alternative explanations deserve far more serious consideration than they received. Theme 2. The pineapple as temporal marker and the question of access. Let's return to that pineapple because the more we examine it, the less it behaves like a minor detail and the more it functions as a fault line running through the entire timeline. The biological fact is undisputable. Partially digested pineapple was present in JonBenét's system, suggesting consumption within roughly 2 to 4 hours before her passing. Both parents explicitly repeatedly denied feeding her anything after returning home from the Whites' party. They described her as deeply asleep, unresponsive, transferred directly to bed, no snack, no waking, no interaction beyond the physical transport from car to bedroom. So we have a gap, a space where something happened that doesn't fit the narrative we've been given. The conventional investigative interpretation was straightforward. The parents were lying. The pineapple proved JonBenét was awake after returning home, which contradicted their statements, which indicated deception, which suggested consciousness of guilt. The logic seems clear, linear, but it rests on the assumption that if the parents didn't feed her, they must know who did and are concealing that knowledge for incriminating reasons. What if there's another possibility? One that's more disturbing precisely because it doesn't require parental dishonesty but instead suggests something they genuinely didn't know was happening. Consider the alternative. JonBenét ate pineapple, but the parents weren't aware of it because they weren't present when it occurred. She woke at some point after being put to bed. Children do this, particularly after exciting days when sleep is light and restless. She went downstairs, hungry or thirsty or simply awake and looking for comfort. And someone else was there. Someone who knew where the pineapple was kept, who felt comfortable enough in that house to prepare food, who had access to this child when her parents believed she was safely sleeping upstairs. The pineapple, in this reading, becomes evidence not of parental deception but of intrusion the family never detected. Someone moving through their space with enough familiarity to operate unnoticed. This interpretation requires us to accept something deeply unsettling about access and vulnerability. Houses are supposed to be private sanctuaries, spaces where we control who enters and when. The idea that someone could be present in your home, interacting with your child while you sleep upstairs unaware. It violates our fundamental sense of security and control. It's psychologically easier to believe the parents are lying than to accept that kind of violation could occur without detection. But ease of acceptance doesn't determine truth. The forensic evidence, the unidentified DNA, the unknown palm print, the shoe impressions from a brand the family didn't own, all points towards someone having access who shouldn't have. The pineapple might simply be one more piece of that pattern, one more indication that someone was there, present, interacting while the family remained unaware. From a criminological perspective, we should ask, what would such access require? Not forced entry through a window, leaving obvious disturbance. but perhaps knowledge of how to enter through doors that were typically left unlocked. The Ramseys, like many families in their neighborhood, didn't always engage all locks, particularly during holiday periods when guests came and went. Perhaps a key obtained through prior access or copied during some earlier legitimate entry. Perhaps simply familiarity with the household patterns, knowing when people would be out, when they'd return, when they'd be deeply enough asleep that movement downstairs wouldn't be detected. This level of knowledge suggests either someone from within the extended household circle, service providers, frequent visitors, individuals trusted enough to have been present multiple times, or someone who'd been watching, learning patterns, preparing. The psychological dimension of this possibility is perhaps most disturbing. If someone had access over time, if they'd been present in that house on prior occasions, if they'd developed familiarity with routines and vulnerabilities, we're describing predatory behavior that's patient, calculating, deeply controlled. Not a spontaneous intrusion, but a cultivated access built gradually, perhaps over weeks or months. The pineapple might represent a moment when that access became observable, a trace left behind that revealed presence the family never suspected. How many other times had someone been there, moving through those spaces without leaving evidence the family would notice? The thought is almost unbearable, which might be why the investigation preferred to believe the parents were lying rather than confront what truthful denial would actually imply about the violation that had occurred. Anthropologically, we should consider what this tells us about the cultural moment and social context of Boulder in 1996. This was before widespread home security systems, before the surveillance culture we live in now. Trust was more common. Doors were often unlocked. The neighborhood was affluent, educated, considered safe, the kind of place where people didn't worry about intrusion because crime wasn't supposed to happen to people like them in places like this. That very sense of security created vulnerability, created conditions where someone could exploit trust and access without raising alarm. The Ramseys weren't negligent. They were operating within the normal parameters of their cultural context. But those parameters assumed safety that may not have existed, assumed privacy that may have been an illusion someone was deliberately cultivating and exploiting. The philosophical question becomes, when we demand that parents account for every moment, remember every detail, explain every inconsistency, are we recognizing the limits of human awareness and memory? Or are we operating from an assumption that parents should have total knowledge of everything occurring in their household, and that gaps in knowledge indicate deception rather than simply the normal boundaries of perception? We don't actually observe every moment of our children's lives. We don't maintain conscious awareness of household spaces we're not currently occupying. We trust that locked or even unlocked doors provide security, that bedrooms upstairs are private spaces, that food appearing to have been consumed must have occurred in moments we were aware of. But these assumptions can be false. Someone can exploit our blind spots. And when that happens, when violation occurs in spaces we believed were secure, the natural response is often denial, not deceptive denial, but the genuine cognitive difficulty of accepting that such violation was possible. From a criminal mindset perspective, someone who would cultivate access over time, who would move through a household learning patterns and routines, who would interact with a child in ways that left minimal trace, we're describing someone with extraordinary patience and control. This isn't impulsive behavior. This is strategic, planned, psychologically organized. The pineapple might have been intentional, a way of establishing that JonBenét was awake, was approachable, would accept food from this person without alarm or resistance. It creates a moment of ordinary domesticity, sharing a snack that normalizes the person's presence, makes what follows seem less like violent intrusion and more like an interaction that started normally and escalated beyond control. This psychological framing serves the perpetrator's internal narrative, allows them to see themselves as something other than a predator, creates a story they can tell themselves about what happened and why. Logically, if we accept the parents' denial as truthful, that they didn't feed her, didn't know she'd eaten, then the pineapple becomes powerful evidence pointing away from them and towards someone else with access. But the investigation couldn't accept that logic because it would mean admitting their entire framework was built on false foundation. It would mean the parents weren't lying, weren't staging, weren't guilty, which would mean months of investigation had been misdirected, resources misallocated, public statements made that couldn't be retracted without enormous institutional cost. The cognitive and professional investment in the family guilt theory was so substantial that evidence contradicting it had to be reinterpreted, minimized, explained away. The pineapple couldn't be what it appeared to be, evidence of unknown access, so it became instead evidence of parental deception despite the lack of logical motive for lying about something so seemingly minor. Theme 3. Scene contamination as tragedy compounding tragedy. We need to examine the scene contamination not as investigative error in the abstract, but as a specific documentable series of decisions that transformed what might have been a solvable case into an enduring mystery. The moment Patsy called friends to come provide support, the moment those friends were allowed to remain in the house, the moment multiple people began moving through spaces that should have been preserved, each of these moments represented a choice. Understandable in human terms, catastrophic in forensic terms. And the responsibility for those choices doesn't rest primarily with the Ramseys, who were operating in shock and crisis mode, but with the responding officers who failed to secure the scene according to basic investigative protocol. Detective Bob Whitson later acknowledged that it looked like a legitimate kidnapping, which explained why the scene wasn't immediately treated as a potential homicide requiring strict preservation. The ransom note, the missing child, the wealthy family, it fit the kidnapping profile, so the response followed kidnapping protocols rather than homicide protocols. But this early categorization error had cascading consequences. Friends and family moved freely through the house, touching surfaces, potentially disturbing evidence, their DNA and trace materials mingling with whatever had been left by the person responsible. When John Ramsey later found JonBenét's body in the wine cellar and brought her upstairs, a deeply human response, the need to remove his daughter from that terrible space, he further contaminated what should have been a pristine scene, making it nearly impossible to determine which evidence came from the critical timeline and which came from the chaotic hours of response. From a forensic perspective, contamination doesn't just obscure evidence, it creates false leads and raises questions that can never be definitively answered. The DNA found on JonBenét's clothing, was it deposited during the crime or during the morning chaos when people were embracing each other, sharing tissues, moving through the house in distress? The fibers from Patsy's jacket found on the duct tape, were they transfer from the crime itself or from Patsy's contact with JonBenét's body after discovery? Every piece of physical evidence became subject to competing interpretations, with defense experts arguing contamination and prosecution experts arguing probative value. The crime scene itself became a battleground of interpretation rather than a source of clear answers, all because those first crucial hours weren't managed with the rigor that homicide investigation requires. Psychologically, we need to understand what this contamination did to the investigation beyond just the forensic complications. It created a situation where investigators could never be entirely certain what evidence meant, which bred frustration and suspicion. When you can't trust your physical evidence because the scene was compromised, you rely more heavily on behavioral analysis, statement consistency, gut feeling about who seems guilty. All the subjective measures that confirmation bias most easily corrupts. The contamination forced investigators into interpretive modes rather than evidential ones, and those interpretive modes led them toward the family because behavior could be read as suspicious in ways that uncontaminated physical evidence might have contradicted. If the scene had been pristine, if the DNA and palm print and shoe impressions had been documented and preserved without the complication of known contamination, would the investigation have taken a different path? We'll never know. The contamination foreclosed certain investigative possibilities permanently. Anthropologically, the scene contamination reveals something about cultural expectations around support during crisis. In the Ramsey's social context, calling friends during emergency was natural, expected, almost automatic. You don't face terrible things alone. You gather your support network, your community. The police allowed this because they shared those cultural expectations and because the situation appeared to be kidnapping, not homicide. The child wasn't there, so there was no body to protect, no death scene to preserve. But this cultural script, appropriate in many crisis situations, was catastrophic in this particular circumstance. The collision between cultural norms of community support and forensic needs of scene preservation created a gap where critical evidence was lost or hopelessly complicated. From a criminological standpoint, we should note that sophisticated perpetrators understand and exploit scene contamination. If someone knew the family well enough to predict they'd call friends, knew the Boulder police well enough to anticipate relatively loose scene control in what appeared to be a kidnapping, they might have factored that contamination into their planning. The chaos would obscure their traces, create investigative confusion, shift focus toward the family whose behavior during the chaos would inevitably seem inconsistent and suspicious to outside observers. This level of sophistication again points towards someone with knowledge of both the family and investigative procedures. Not a random intruder, but someone embedded enough in similar social contexts to understand how such situations typically unfold. The philosophical dimension asks us to consider questions of responsibility and blame in ways that resist easy assignment. Who is responsible for the scene contamination? The parents for calling friends, the friends for coming to provide support, the police for failing to secure the scene. Everyone acted according to their training, their cultural context, their understanding of the situation in real time. No one set out to destroy evidence, yet the collective result was investigative catastrophe. This reveals how tragedy can compound itself. The initial terrible act creates crisis, crisis creates chaotic response creates conditions that make solving the initial terrible act nearly impossible. Blame becomes diffuse, distributed across multiple actors with understandable motives, none of whom individually caused the outcome but whose combined actions produced it nonetheless. Logically, the contamination serves the person responsible's interests perfectly, whether or not they specifically planned for it. Every ambiguous piece of evidence, every question that can't be definitively answered, every alternative interpretation of physical findings. All of this creates reasonable doubt, creates investigative confusion, creates conditions where the case becomes unsolvable. Not because evidence doesn't exist, but because that evidence can't speak clearly through the noise of contamination. The person responsible benefits from every moment of that chaos, from every person who moved through that house, leaving traces that would later complicate forensic analysis. And the ultimate tragedy is that this benefit, this protection through chaos, likely wasn't the result of sophisticated criminal planning, but simply the natural consequence of human response to crisis colliding with the requirements of proper investigation. 3. The unsolved equation: motive, evidence, and the psychological cost. The investigation stalled not because evidence was absent, but because the prevailing theory couldn't reconcile itself with irrefutable forensic facts, creating profound conflicts within the justice system itself. We've watched this pattern before in other cases, but rarely with such stark clarity. The collision between institutional certainty and scientific reality, between what investigators needed to believe and what the evidence actually demonstrated. According to Mark Beckner, who would later become police chief, the department's focus remained fixed on the family primarily because they refused to accept there was a legitimate point of entry. The basement window area was undisturbed, showing no fresh footprints in the dust or mold, no obvious signs of recent passage. This observation became the linchpin of the entire investigative theory. If no one entered from outside, then the perpetrator must have already been inside. The logic seems sound until we examine it more carefully. The absence of disturbance proves only that entry didn't occur through that specific window in a way that left obvious traces. It doesn't prove entry didn't occur through other means. Unlocked doors, keys obtained through prior access, windows elsewhere in the house, entry during earlier time periods when the family was out. The investigative reasoning made a classic logical error, mistaking absence of evidence for evidence of absence. They couldn't identify how someone got in, so they concluded no one got in from outside. But this conclusion was directly contradicted by physical evidence that should have been impossible to ignore. In the 2008 exoneration documents, we learn the full extent of what that physical evidence revealed. Unidentified male DNA not matching any Ramsey family member was found in 3 locations on 2 separate articles of JonBenét's clothing. The DNA in her undergarment was consistent with saliva, intimate contact, not casual transfer. The DNA on her clothing waistband was touch DNA, likely from skin cells transferred during direct handling. This wasn't trace contamination from manufacturing or incidental contact. The quantity, location, and profile characteristics pointed definitively towards sustained, intimate contact between JonBenét and an unknown male. Additionally, the legal review in Wolf v. Ramsey summarized undisputed facts, including unidentified HITEC brand shoe impressions found in the basement near the wine cellar area. Neither Parent nor Burke owned this brand. This was confirmed through exhaustive inventory. An unidentified palm print was discovered on the wine cellar door, again matching no known family member or authorized individual who had legitimate reason to be in that space. Let's pause here and examine what we're being asked to accept. The investigation maintained focus on family involvement despite DNA evidence pointing to an unknown male. Despite shoe impressions from a brand the family didn't own, despite a palm print that couldn't be matched to anyone with known access. Each piece of evidence considered individually might be explained away. Contamination, old impressions from prior visitors, untracked contacts from service people or guests. But collectively, these pieces form a pattern. They point towards someone who had physical, intimate contact with JonBenét, who was present in the basement area where her body was found, who left biological and physical traces that have never been identified despite decades of investigation and database comparison. Why did the local police discount this overwhelming pattern of evidence? John Ramsey suspected they were blowing off the other inputs because they were so fixed on the family, so invested in their theory that contradictory evidence couldn't be integrated without dismantling everything they'd constructed. The true tragedy here lies in confirmation bias prevailing over scientific method, a pattern we've seen too often but rarely with such clear documentation of the process. Confirmation bias operates at multiple cognitive levels: perceptual, memorial, interpretive. We notice information that confirms our beliefs more readily than information that contradicts them. We remember confirming instances more vividly and in greater detail. We interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support rather than challenge our existing frameworks. None of this is conscious or malicious. It's simply how human cognition manages overwhelming complexity by creating efficient filtering systems. But in investigative contexts, those same efficient filters can create blind spots so profound that clear evidence becomes invisible. Watch how this played out in the Ramsey investigation. The DNA became contamination despite forensic analysis suggesting otherwise. The palm print became could be anyone despite systematic elimination ruling out known individuals. The shoe impressions became irrelevant despite their location and the absence of that brand from family possessions. Each piece of exculpatory evidence was individually dismissed through ad hoc reasoning that sounded plausible in isolation. But the cumulative effect was to prevent any single piece of contradictory evidence from reaching the weight necessary to challenge the core theory. This is confirmation bias in its most dangerous form. Not a single catastrophic error, but 1,000 small interpretive choices, each defensible individually, collectively pointing investigation away from truth and toward predetermined conclusion. Theme 1. The motive that doesn't exist and the theory that requires it. We need to examine the motive theory the police advanced because it reveals something profound about how desperation for explanation can create narratives that collapse under the weight of psychological implausibility. The prevailing police theory centered on a domestic accident, specifically that Patsy flew into rage over bedwetting and either struck JonBenét or caused injury that led to her passing, then staged the elaborate scene to conceal this moment of lost control. This theory required a specific psychological sequence. Sudden, explosive rage powerful enough to cause lethal harm, followed immediately by calculated staging requiring hours of focused, complex work. The theory asks us to believe someone could transition instantaneously from uncontrolled violence to sophisticated criminal planning, from emotional chaos to methodical execution. But let's examine what we know about Patsy Ramsey's documented history and whether it provides any foundation for this theory. John Ramsey emphasized in his 1998 interview that Patsy had fought and survived stage 4 ovarian cancer precisely so she could be with the children. When doctors told her the cancer was likely terminal, when treatment options were brutal and success improbable, she chose to fight anyway because her stated, documented, repeatedly expressed motivation was to be present for JonBenét and Burke's lives. She endured aggressive chemotherapy that devastated her body. She underwent radical surgery. She participated in experimental protocols. All of this while maintaining focus on a single goal: surviving to be their mother. The idea that this determined survival instinct, this fierce maternal drive that had sustained her through years of medical crisis, would be instantaneously derailed by a minor domestic issue and replaced by homicidal rage. It requires us to believe in psychological discontinuity so extreme it erases everything we know about this person's documented priorities, values, and character. Could people act radically out of character under extreme stress? Of course. Human beings are capable of terrible things under the wrong combination of circumstances. But we're not talking about a momentary lapse or impulsive reaction in isolation. We're talking about sustained behavior over hours that contradicts every documented pattern of this person's life. Someone who fought cancer to be with her children supposedly took actions that would guarantee separation from her surviving child, either through imprisonment if discovered, or through the psychological burden of concealed guilt that would make authentic connection impossible. The psychological implausibility is staggering. It requires us to imagine someone whose entire documented life centered on maternal connection suddenly acting in ways that would destroy that connection permanently. From a psychological perspective, let's examine what rage incidents actually look like versus what the evidence showed. When parents lose control and cause harm to children in rage incidents, certain patterns are typical and well documented. The violence is usually explosive, chaotic, leaving evidence of the emotional state in which it occurred. Furniture disturbed, items broken or thrown, signs of struggle, injuries consistent with repeated strikes or impacts showing loss of control. The aftermath typically involves immediate panic, calling for help, often with fabricated explanations but still seeking medical intervention. attempts to undo what occurred or minimize its severity. What we don't typically see is transition to hours of methodical staging requiring sustained focus and complex planning. The emotional and physiological state that produces explosive violence doesn't simply switch off, allowing calm, strategic thinking. The adrenaline, the elevated heart rate, the compromised prefrontal cortex function, these persist for extended periods. The idea that someone could move from rage sufficient to cause lethal harm to composed staging, requiring careful attention to detail, strains credulity beyond reasonable limits. Anthropologically, we should consider what this theory reveals about cultural assumptions around gender, class, and maternal behavior. The mother snaps narrative is culturally familiar, appearing in news stories and crime narratives regularly enough to feel plausible despite its statistical rarity in cases involving serious harm. There's a cultural script about maternal perfection concealing breaking points, about the pressure of maintaining appearances in affluent communities, about the gap between public presentation and private reality. These scripts aren't baseless. They reflect real patterns that exist in some cases. But their cultural familiarity makes them psychologically available in ways that can override evidence. The police seem to reach for this familiar narrative because it made cultural sense, because it fit templates they'd encountered before, even though the evidence in this specific case didn't actually support its application. From a forensic criminology perspective, if we examine cases where parents have staged scenes to conceal harm to children, we see recognizable patterns that differ significantly from what we observe here. Staged scenes typically show evidence of the staging, overcorrection, performative elements that don't quite align with authentic crime patterns, hesitation marks, inconsistencies between different elements of the scene. The Ramsey crime scene showed sophistication that troubled even experienced investigators. The garrote wasn't performative, it was functional, constructed with understanding of mechanical principles. The binding showed specific characteristics suggesting someone with knowledge or experience. The note demonstrated literary quality and psychological complexity beyond typical staging attempts. If this was staging by someone in panic trying to deflect suspicion, it succeeded at a level that would be remarkable even for experienced criminals, let alone a mother with no documented background in deception or criminal behavior. Philosophically, we're confronted with questions about burden of proof and the gap between what's theoretically possible and what's actually probable. Yes, it's theoretically possible that Patsy underwent radical psychological transformation in a moment of crisis, developing capabilities she'd never shown before and would never show again. It's theoretically possible that someone could transition from explosive rage to methodical staging instantaneously. It's theoretically possible that maternal instinct could be overridden so completely by rage over bedwetting that years of fought-for survival and documented devotion would become irrelevant. But probability matters. When we stack theoretical possibilities that are each individually unlikely, creating a sequence where all must occur simultaneously for the theory to work, we've moved from reasonable hypothesis to something requiring belief despite evidence rather than because of it. The motive theory collapses not because it's impossible, but because it requires too many psychological improbabilities occurring simultaneously, while requiring us to dismiss contrary evidence of character, capability, and documented priorities. What we're left with is a theory maintained not because evidence supports it, but because abandoning it would require institutional acknowledgement of profound investigative misdirection. The theory became too expensive to abandon, creating a kind of sunk cost fallacy where continued investment seemed preferable to admitting the initial direction was fundamentally flawed. Theme 2: The adversarial turn and the death of cooperative investigation. We need to examine the moment when the investigation shifted from crisis response to adversarial confrontation. because that shift transformed what might have been cooperative truth-seeking into a battle where both sides became entrenched in positions that precluded actual investigation. According to John Ramsey's account, the adversarial turn came early, when the police refused to release JonBenét's body for burial until the parents submitted to interrogation while under suspicion. Think about what that decision communicates. We believe you're responsible, and we're willing to use your need to bury your child as leverage to force cooperation. It's a hardball tactic that might make strategic sense if you're certain of guilt and trying to break resistance, but it's devastating if the parents are actually innocent, if they're grieving and traumatized and suddenly realize that the authorities view them not as victims deserving support but as suspects to be pressured into confession. From that moment forward, the investigation became characterized by mutual distrust that made truth-seeking nearly impossible. The parents, following legal advice, became guarded in their statements, limited their cooperation, proceeded with the caution of people who understood they were being investigated for the unthinkable. The police interpreted this guardedness as consciousness of guilt, as the behavior of people hiding something. But it was also entirely rational behavior for innocent people who'd realized they were primary suspects, protecting themselves from an investigation that seemed determined to build a case against them regardless of evidence. The cycle reinforced itself. Police suspicion created family defensiveness, which confirmed police suspicion, which intensified family defensiveness, spiraling into complete investigative deadlock where neither side could see the other clearly through the accumulated hostility and mistrust. Psychologically, we should understand this dynamic not as unique failure but as predictable outcome when investigation becomes adversarial before evidence justifies that stance. When police treat grieving families as suspects from the outset, they trigger protective responses that then get interpreted as suspicious behavior. The natural human response to being accused of something horrific you didn't do is to protect yourself, to seek legal counsel, to be careful about statements, to avoid situations where anything you say might be misconstrued. But these protective behaviors look identical to the behaviors we'd expect from guilty parties trying to avoid incrimination. The investigative framework couldn't distinguish between protection of innocence and protection of guilt because both produce similar observable behaviors. Without clear evidence distinguishing the two, interpretation depends entirely on prior assumption about guilt, creating circular reasoning where suspicion justifies adversarial approach, which produces defensive behavior, which confirms suspicion. From an anthropological perspective, this adversarial turn reflects broader cultural patterns in American criminal justice where accusation and defense become binary positions rather than collaborative truth-seeking. We operate from an adversarial model: prosecution versus defense, suspicion versus protestation, interrogation versus resistance. This model serves certain functions, particularly in protecting rights against state power. But it also creates conditions where truth can become secondary to winning, where evidence gets filtered through the lens of building or defending against a case rather than being followed wherever it leads. The Ramsey investigation became trapped in this adversarial model early when collaborative investigation might have served truth better. From a forensic criminology perspective, the adversarial turn had concrete investigative consequences beyond just relationship dynamics. When the family stopped cooperating fully, certain investigative avenues closed. The police couldn't conduct follow-up interviews as readily. They couldn't pursue lines of questioning that emerged from developing evidence. They couldn't get voluntary cooperation on searches or evidence collection. This forced them to proceed through legal channels, warrants, subpoenas, formal processes that took time and created additional adversarial framing. Meanwhile, the family's legal team began conducting their own investigation, hiring their own experts, developing alternative theories. This created competing investigations rather than a single focused effort, with evidence and findings sometimes not shared across the divide. The fragmentation made solving the case exponentially more difficult. Philosophically, we're confronted with questions about the proper relationship between state authority and individual rights during investigation. The police felt they had probable cause to suspect the family and were justified in using all available tools to pursue that theory. The family felt they were being persecuted for a crime they didn't commit and were justified in protecting themselves through legal means. Both positions have merit in abstract, but the collision between them created conditions where truth became nearly impossible to access. What would cooperative investigation have looked like? What if the police had pursued the DNA evidence as vigorously as they pursued the family theory? What if the family had been treated as grieving victims who might have information rather than as suspects to be broken? We'll never know what that alternative path might have yielded because the adversarial turn foreclosed it early and completely. The cost of this adversarial dynamic extended beyond just investigative efficiency. In the interview with Detective Haney, Patsy Ramsey was confronted with medical records suggesting signs of prior intrusion. Information she stated she was entirely unaware of and which clearly distressed her. This moment is extraordinary for what it reveals about the information asymmetry in the investigation. The police had access to medical records, autopsy findings, forensic details that the family didn't possess. When they used that information in confrontational ways during interrogation, they created moments of genuine shock and confusion that they interpreted as performance, rather than authentic emotional response to devastating new information. If Patsy didn't know about prior medical findings because nothing in the family's awareness explained them, her shock makes perfect sense as genuine surprise. But in the adversarial framework, every reaction became suspect, every emotional response potentially performance. The investigation lost the ability to distinguish authentic from performed because it had stopped looking for that distinction, having already decided which was which. Theme 3. The exoneration that came too late and the system that failed truth. The eventual scientific exoneration confirmed what the forensic evidence had been indicating all along, but it came at a cost that can never be recovered. Years of destroyed reputation, a mother who died before seeing her name cleared, a family that will never get back the time spent under suspicion rather than in grief. Boulder County District Attorney Mary Lacey's 2008 public letter, based on advanced DNA analysis techniques that had become available in the years since the crime, declared unequivocally that the unidentified male DNA found in multiple locations on JonBenét's clothing belonged to the person responsible. The letter explicitly cleared John, Patsy, and Burke Ramsey of any suspicion in the commission of this crime. The scientific evidence had finally accumulated weight that institutional resistance could no longer override. The DNA was too definitive, too clearly foreign to the family, too consistent across multiple samples to be dismissed as contamination or coincidence. But this vindication arrived nearly 2 years after Patsy Ramsey had passed away from her cancer, which had returned and proven terminal. According to John Ramsey's statements, Patsy died carrying the weight of public suspicion, never seeing the scientific evidence finally acknowledged in the way it should have been from the beginning. She endured years of being portrayed in media as a likely perpetrator, years of knowing that millions of people believed she had taken her own daughter's life, years of living under suspicion while trying to grieve and maintain some semblance of family life with her surviving child. The psychological cost of that sustained persecution while simultaneously battling cancer and processing genuine grief approaches the unimaginable. The exoneration came too late for the person who perhaps needed it most, not for legal protection but for the simple human dignity of being believed when telling the truth. John Ramsey's statements about the impact reveal the broader cost of investigative misdirection. The initial suspicion and subsequent media frenzy, which authorities had intentionally fueled by leaking information, hoping to create public pressure that would force a confession, had taken crushing toll on the family's ability to function. Every moment of their private loss had been conducted under public scrutiny. Journalists camped outside their home. Their every movement, every statement, every expression was analyzed for signs of guilt. Friends and community members retreated, unsure what to believe, unwilling to publicly associate with people under such suspicion. Burke grew up under the shadow of his sister's case and his family's suspected involvement. The isolation was profound, the psychological burden extraordinary, and all of it based on an investigative theory that scientific evidence would eventually disprove, but only after the damage had become irreparable. From a forensic perspective, the exoneration represents the triumph of scientific method over institutional bias, but it also reveals how long that triumph can be delayed when cognitive commitment to a theory becomes entrenched. The DNA evidence existed from the beginning. Early analysis showed it was foreign to the family, but the investigative framework dismissed it as contamination or irrelevant trace evidence because accepting it as probative would have required abandoning the family theory that had become central to the entire case. Only when technology advanced enough to allow more sophisticated analysis, touch DNA from skin cells, more detailed profiles, better understanding of transfer mechanisms, did the evidence finally speak loudly enough to overcome institutional resistance. But that shouldn't have been necessary. The pattern was visible in the original evidence if investigators had been willing to see it. Unknown male DNA in intimate locations, unknown palm print, unknown shoe impressions. Each piece, considered without the bias of predetermined conclusion, pointed away from the family. Together they screamed it. But confirmation bias is powerful enough to render screaming evidence into whispers easily ignored. Anthropologically, the delayed exoneration reveals something about how difficult it is for institutions to admit error, particularly when that error has been public and sustained. The Boulder Police Department's investigation had been high profile, generating intense media coverage with investigators making statements suggesting family involvement. The grand jury, though not voting to indict, had heard evidence presented through the lens of family suspicion. For the department to acknowledge that years of investigation had been misdirected, that resources had been misallocated, that public statements had contributed to wrongful persecution, the institutional cost of such acknowledgement is enormous. It requires admitting not just tactical errors but fundamental failure of investigative judgment. Human institutions resist such admissions because they threaten legitimacy, invite criticism, expose leadership to accountability. The resistance isn't necessarily malicious, it's protective, defensive, rooted in the same confirmation bias that directed the initial investigation. The pattern perpetuates itself. Investment in a position makes that position harder to abandon, which increases investment, which makes abandonment harder still. From a criminal justice perspective, this case becomes a cautionary tale about how investigations can fail, not through lack of effort or resources, but through the very human tendency to construct narratives and then defend them against reality. Every investigator who worked this case undoubtedly cared deeply about finding truth and achieving justice. Their commitment was real, their intentions honorable, their effort sustained over years. But commitment and good intentions don't automatically produce truth. Sometimes they produce the opposite, a determined certainty that prevents seeing what's actually present in the evidence. The forensic facts were always there. The DNA, the palm print, the shoe impressions, these weren't ambiguous findings that emerged later. They were documented early and remained consistent throughout. What changed wasn't the evidence, but finally, reluctantly, the willingness to accept what it actually indicated. Philosophically, we're left with profound questions about the nature of justice and whether its delayed arrival constitutes justice at all. John and Patsy Ramsey were eventually cleared, but Patsy didn't live to experience that clearing. Their family will never recover the years spent under suspicion. Their daughter's case remains unsolved because the years that should have been spent following the DNA evidence and pursuing other suspects were instead spent trying to build a case against the family. The person actually responsible has remained free for decades, potentially committing other harms, certainly never facing accountability for this one. Justice in any meaningful sense hasn't been achieved. The exoneration brought technical vindication but not restoration of what was lost, not accountability for the actual perpetrator, not even full acknowledgement from all parties that the misdirection occurred and caused profound harm. The legacy of this case is painful and multifaceted. A child was taken in terrible circumstances. Her family was destroyed not just by the loss but by being wrongfully suspected of causing it. An investigation that should have followed clear forensic evidence instead pursued a theory contradicted by that evidence, creating a failure that compounds the original tragedy. We're left asking questions that may never be answered. Who was responsible? How did they have access? Why didn't the investigation follow the DNA from the beginning? How many other cases have failed in similar ways, where institutional certainty overrode scientific evidence? What reforms would prevent such failures in the future? The legacy of this unsolved case is not merely the tragic loss of a child, though that remains the irreducible center of everything else. The legacy is also the painful lesson in how institutional bias and misplaced certainty led an investigation down the wrong path, failing to follow truth even when the evidence was staring them in the face, thereby allowing the person truly responsible to escape into the silence while a family endured years of wrongful persecution. We've examined the riddle of the ransom note, the temporal impossibilities of the staging theory, the pineapple that whispers access no one acknowledged, the scene contamination that obscured more than it revealed, the adversarial turn that foreclosed cooperation, the DNA evidence that pointed away from the family from the very beginning. Each element tells the same story if we're willing to hear it. The investigation looked where it expected to find guilt rather than where the evidence actually led. And in that gap between expectation and reality, truth was lost, perhaps permanently, certainly at a cost too high to measure.